What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here. Back to review Ari Aster's latest film, Beau Is Afraid, starring Joaquin Phoenix. And initially, I'll avoid any plot-specific revelations or discussions or whatever in case you're still on the fence about whether or not you want to see it. But toward the end of the video, I will need to reference a few specific scenes just to kind of reinforce the points that I want to make. But to say that I was excited about this movie in advance would be a serious understatement. I think Ari Aster is one of the most talented, maybe the most talented director under 40 working in, at least in the United States right now. And of course it helps that he's a New Yorker and he makes movies that absolutely appeal to my taste. I mean, I know Hereditary divided a lot of people. I think Midsommar divided a lot of people, but I thought both of those films were absolutely astonishing. And so I was so excited to see this. I went up to see this on the largest IMAX screen in America up at the AMC Lincoln Square here in New York. It's 75 feet tall. It's 101 feet wide. So the conditions were ideal to have the best possible first impression of this film. That said, I really feel like I need to see this a second time before I'll know for sure exactly what I think, because there's a lot about this film that I found to be absolutely first rate, absolutely brilliant. And then there were some other parts where I was like, Ari Aster is fucking with us or trying to needlessly provoke us or being needlessly complex or whatever the case might be. I have a feeling this is going to be one of those movies where whether you love it, hate it, or somewhere in between, it's going to be one of the most fun movies to discuss for film freaks, because I feel like flawed masterpieces or bad movies with great scenes are always the ones that lend themselves to the most interesting conversations. If something's an obvious masterpiece, I mean, you can sit around praising it and more power to you. Or if something completely, totally sucks, well, that can be its own form of fun, taking shots at it. But I have a feeling this is going to be one of those movies where people have to really wrestle with it. And if people walk out of it like storming out in a huff, I get it, because I think by far the worst scene of the entire movie comes at the end. And it almost feels like, well, at the very end when it says written and directed by Ari Aster, and you're like, that's the final shot, that's the final scene. My first impression was that is a double bird to the audience. Like, go fuck yourself if you have any complaints about this movie. And I realize I doubt Ari Aster or A24 had those intentions, but that's what it felt like at that precise moment. I was like, I cannot believe you're sending me back out into the street with that as my final impression of this film, because early on in the film, like the first 30 minutes, I could not believe what I was watching. I was just enraptured. I was enthralled. The only way I can describe it is as an apocalyptic dark comedy, but maybe I should provide some of the kind of broad strokes before I go any further. So here are the basics from its entry over on Wikipedia. Beau Is Afraid is a 2023 American surrealist black comedy horror film written, directed, and co-produced by Ari Aster. The film stars Joaquin Phoenix as the titular Beau Wasserman, a mild-mannered but paranoia-ridden man who embarks on a surreal odyssey to his hometown for his mother's funeral, confronting his greatest fears along the way. The film also includes a supporting ensemble cast that includes Patti LuPone, Nathan Lane, Amy Ryan, Kylie Rogers, Parker Posey, Stephen McKinley Henderson, Haley Squires, Michael Gandolfini, Zoe Lister-Jones, and Richard Kind. Beau Is Afraid was co-produced and distributed by A24 and was debuted at the Alamo Drafthouse Cinema on April 1st, 2023. It is scheduled to be widely released on April 21st. That is next weekend. And quick side note about Richard Kind that is totally irrelevant to this review, but I recently went to a Bruce Springsteen concert, and as I was walking out to grab a beer at one point, Richard Kind was sitting on the row, and I saw him, and I was like, oh, because I recognized him from movies, but my reaction, I think, was confusing for him. I think he thought maybe we knew each other, so he was like, hey, and he kind of gave me one of those. I was like, woohoo, and I just kept going. I was like, I don't want to spoil the illusion that he and I have a deep, long-lasting connection. But getting back to my first impressions of the film, and I do want to emphasize, these are my first impressions, and I know that sounds totally cowardly and non-committal and chicken shit, but it's a complicated movie. It's incredibly ambitious, and it's incredibly stylish, and it's incredibly immersive. It is nutrient dense. It requires a ton of heavy lifting on the part of the audience, and obviously a lot of heavy lifting on the part of the cast and crew, because this is one of those complex psychological dramas wrestling with mommy issues. And I know that's an oversimplification, but Beau is one of those characters where his entire life has been dominated by and supported by this incredibly powerful, this incredibly intense, this incredibly demanding woman, and he's all fucked up as a result. And because the character of Beau is heavily medicated and incredibly paranoid and prone to hallucinations and intense dreams and just kind of out-of-body experiences, you never quite know where you are. Like, you never really feel like you're on firm footing when you watch this flick, because you're always wondering, is the world around him a projection of his own paranoid fantasies? Is it really this disturbing and screwed up? Is he reacting to it? It's almost like German expressionism, where the outside world reflects the internal struggle of like the psychology of the main character, which leads to some of the most killer production design imaginable. But the movie is very mysterious. It's oftentimes hysterical, and it can at times be abruptly quite terrifying, where you're just like, ooh, your heart will seize up with certain shots and certain emotions. And as I said before, I think at times that it is quite brilliant. And then there are other times where it almost feels needlessly impenetrable, almost as if it's like Ari Aster were trying to disguise the fact that maybe there's not as much of a core to this bloated 3-hour film as he would like to believe. And I know there'll be some like ride or die, diehard Ari Aster fans who say this is a masterpiece and they will love every second. I'm inclined to believe that there's a 2-hour masterpiece tucked away inside this movie. But like many directors who've enjoyed some early success, I mean, both Midsommar as well as Hereditary did quite well, were very popular. I have a feeling that A24 was willing to roll the dice and give Ari Aster a lot of leeway and a lot of slack on the rope and say, let's see if you hang yourself or not. Go for it. But the budget's $35 million. This is the biggest movie and the biggest risk and the biggest calculated gamble of A24's now, I guess, a 11-year run. And they're coming off of nearly like a clean sweep at the Oscars this year. Like A24 has been slowly but surely graduating in a very organic way to larger and larger productions. It's been thrilling to see because they have excellent taste and they have an excellent relationship with some of the best directors in the world. But I have a feeling that it might be a struggle for this movie to get its money back, because I think there are going to be a lot of audience members who walk out of it and say, fuck that guy's movies. Ari Aster recently had an interview with IndieWire where he was addressing some of those concerns, and this is what he had to say. And I know I'm going off my review and into yet another article, but I feel like I'm still processing all this stuff. But Ari Aster had this to say: if anything, I'm very aware of the backlash. People who never want to hear my name again. It's the nature of the internet right now, which makes it a weird time to create work. The reactions are so immediate, so superficial in so many ways. I love periods where I do engage, and it's always such a bad idea because it gets into my head. A huge part about making new work is about doing my best to divorce myself from that and not have it affect my thinking. He says, I don't know what people will think of it, but it's the film that I'm proudest of making. And what we're seeing with this movie is part of a time-honored tradition where a young, successful filmmaker, I mean, he's only 36 years old, and he's already made 3 movies, but a young, successful filmmaker will enjoy 1, maybe 2 early successes, and then he'll be given a lot of leeway, he'll be given a lot of goodwill, and they will spend it on what's a giant vanity project or a big personal film. Like, one of the best examples would be Paul Thomas Anderson, where his 3rd film was Magnolia. Hard Eight was a small film, Boogie Nights was bigger, but a total sensation, and he went off and made Magnolia, and a lot of people regard it as his best movie. A lot of people think that it's a kind of pretentious, bloated mess. I think it's somewhere in the middle. And I have a feeling that Beau Is Afraid, for me at least, it's going to settle somewhere between bloated, pretentious mess or a new career high, a colossal cinematic experience of uncompromising vision. But the reason I think so many people are going to be divided on this film is that because it's a giant odyssey, and I don't use that word lightly, but it quite literally isn't, like an odyssey of the human spirit. But every chapter of this story is completely different in style and tone and visual approach. And a lot of people are going to be torn on which little vignettes are their favorite. For me, by far, my favorite vignette is the beginning, where he quite literally lives in this apocalyptic, dystopian, like urban hellscape surrounded by crime and filth and murder and just insanity all around him. But as you're watching it, once again, you're like, is this in his head or is this the reality? And just so many strange, unusual things will happen to him. You get the feeling that it's a bit of both, but the amount of detail and the amount of humor, I mean, it's so hard to celebrate the scene to the degree that I would like to without giving anything away. So maybe I should just go ahead and issue like a mild spoiler warning, because I can't like back up my points unless I call attention to specific details. But as you can tell from this clip in the trailer, just going to and from his building is like a mix of like urban warfare and Night of the Living Dead and Skid Row all stirred together, and they all seem to want to get or kill Beau. And there's a great episode where at one point he accidentally loses his keys So he sets a little like phone book on the door when he runs across the street to get some water because he's taking some pills and he doesn't have any water. And he's been told, absolutely, do not take your pills without water. So he's having a paranoid episode. And as he's getting the water, he's looking over this building and he sees just this army, this stampede of the scariest looking people you've ever seen, slowly but surely going into his building and going up to his apartment and going inside. And on one level, it absolutely is terrifying. But when you realize that this is all part of his kind of paranoid, delusional world, I was like rolling out of my chair, just howling with laughter. I was like, if it can maintain this bleak, apocalyptic comedy, this will end up being one of my favorite movies in recent memory, because it really felt like a throwback to like the mid-late 90s, where there were a lot of really strange, unusual independent filmmakers who were making a name for themselves. Like a great example would be Todd Solondz, where with Welcome to the Dollhouse and Happiness, a lot of people didn't really know what to do with them, but those movies are intensely funny, but made for a very small niche audience. I mean, most people throw up their hands in despair and run screaming in horror from those movies, but if you love them, like they're near and dear to your heart. And so as this movie began and started to unfold, I was like, oh my God, I'm so in. Then the next major vignette is almost as good. It's absolutely hysterical. You've got Nathan Lane and Amy Ryan just absolutely killing it. And they basically rescue Joaquin from a serious crisis in his neighborhood, and they're looking after him and kind of nursing him back to health. And they're just absolutely deliriously funny. But this is also the part where I got my first warning sign that I might not completely, totally embrace or love this movie, because Joaquin Phoenix is doing this kind of this shtick or this routine, which he's used in a bunch of other movies, where he's constantly kind of like bumbling and befuddled and confused and like kind of half asleep and then like half terrified. And it's exhausting for 3 hours to have somebody where you just want to say, look, like drink a cup of coffee, fucking wake up and like put some Visine in your eyes, but like let's tighten up your game. And there is obviously like a method to his madness, and obviously he's a brilliant performer. I think he's one of the best actors of his generation, and he's given us many intense performances. But I like the Joaquin. It's very dynamic and very clear, like the Joaquin that we saw in a movie like The Master from Paul Thomas Anderson. That's the version I like. But when he starts just kind of like sleepwalking his way through an entire movie, in small doses I can take it, but after a while I just want to like slap him and say, snap out of it, like wake up, like open your eyes. But I'm going to contradict myself, because the best comedic bit comes very close to the end of the movie, and I don't know if that bit would have played nearly as well if he hadn't been so befuddled and so foggy and so cloudy and so confused every step of the way, because he suddenly has this moment of catharsis where a lot of emotion comes out all at once. And I was screaming and I was roaring with laughter. I was like, I knew you were in there somewhere, but like all of a sudden, all this pent up emotion and all this pent up kind of pressure and desire, it all comes exploding out of him. And I was just like holding my side. I was laughing so hard. So who knows? Maybe you have to endure 2.5 hours of Joaquin in a cloud in order to enjoy that one joke. And I guess I should offer yet another spoiler warning, because I can't explain why I was laughing so hard without giving a little bit away. But Parker Posey, who's one of my all-time favorite celebrity crushes, particularly back in the 90s when I was in college, when she was doing all this incredible stuff like Waiting for Guffman and all this great Hal Hartley movies. But she pops up as the adult version of Beau's childhood crush. And after all these decades of being apart, they finally get a chance to get it on. And I have to say, Parker Posey, holy shit, she is, she's not as young as she used to be, but she looks fucking incredible in this scene. I mean, it's an intensely, wildly erotic scene. And Beau, who's very inexperienced when it comes to sex, when he finally gets to do the dirty deed, that's when all that emotion comes out of him. But it's a strong contender for what might be the funniest orgasm in movie history. But what's incredible about the scene is how it goes from like intense eroticism to comedy to horror and then back to comedy all in the span of a couple of minutes. And I feel like that's one of the scenes that really exemplifies the best of what this movie has to offer. Because there are abrupt tonal switches constantly throughout, where you think you're terrified and then something hysterical will happen, or you think you're in good hands and then you get absolutely like traumatized to the core of your soul. But suffice to say, if you're familiar with the song Always Be My Baby by Mariah Carey, it'll never be the same for you ever again after that scene. Holy shit. It was world class. But if I were to call attention to some of the scenes that will kind of break the audience or alienate the audience or send some audience members like running screaming for the doorways, around like the halfway to 2/3 mark, there's this like giant kind of fantasy, semi-animated, like almost like stop motion like fantastical adventure that he goes on, where after Beau stumbles into these like lunatics living in the woods where they travel from forest to forest putting on plays, and at a certain point as he's watching the play he kind of gets sucked in and he starts living out the life of the central character, and it becomes almost like an alternate timeline of like a life that Beau might have led before it kind of snaps back to reality and you realize he'd just been watching a play this whole time. But if you wanted to put on your producer hat and be like a mean, sinister, like bean counter, like we need to tighten up the running time in order to make this movie like more commercially viable or more accessible, that would be the sequence that you would remove. And it's some of the most visually spectacular stuff you'll see in the entire movie, but in terms of the plot, has much less to do with the kind of Oedipal issues or the mommy issues at the core of the story, because in the end, this is Beau wrestling with the feelings or his conflicted feelings toward his mother, because sometimes he fantasizes about a life without her and just straight up killing her, and there are other kind of times where it seems like he can't even get out of bed without calling her and like getting her permission. I mean, he's completely consumed with her, but this giant odyssey in the middle, like, wait a second, I mean, this is visually sumptuous and incredibly stylish, but we've kind of we've lost the thread of like the main thrust of the movie. But the biggest problem for me is the ending, where Beau finally has his massive confrontation with his mother, and it's got some great bits, including one bit that I will not give away. There's a certain secret, a really disturbing kind of revelation to be discovered, tucked away in the attic, and throughout his entire life, Beau's never been quite sure, like if this was a dream or if this is something that actually really happened. But we get to see like the source of some of his trauma up in the attic. But there's a big problem where you have two different actresses playing his mother. You've got Patti LuPone playing her as an older woman, and Zoe Lister-Jones playing her as a young woman. And we get exposed to Zoe Lister-Jones early on with some really incredible scenes where we see just how fucked up Beau's childhood was. And once again, this is yet another spoiler alert, but we see Beau as a young man in bed with his mom as she's describing how all the men in their family have this heart murmur, and that when they conceive their children or have sex for the first time, they all tend to die as a result. So it gives Beau all this tension and fear and anxiety about the act of sex, because he thinks if he ever does it, he will just die then and there. But at the same time, his mother, while she's giving him all this fear and anxiety about sex, she's giving him all this weird advice about how he can possibly seduce and woo and conquer this character of Elaine that they've met while on vacation. And Elaine is the character who eventually grows up to be the character played by Parker Posey. But these scenes are really disturbing, just absolutely fascinating, and you can't take your eyes away from the screen, because you just realize you're seeing something kind of deeply disturbing, probably the wrong word, but you're seeing scenes that are going to have a massive impact on Beau's mental health moving forward. And it's always a tough reset for the audience when you have two different actors playing the same character. But the actress playing Mona in like the last third of the movie, unfortunately, just not nearly as good. Like, she's kind of shrill and like she's kind of this harpy, but not in a good way. I get what they're trying to go for, like the domineering, tyrannical mother thing, but it turns into this strange, like, imaginary fantasy trial where Beau's being put on trial for his conflicted feelings toward his mother. And it's the worst stuff in the movie. Like I said, I walked out of the movie kind of pissed. I cannot fucking believe that's how this movie's going to end. So you're always playing with fire if you send the audience out into the street pissed off at the movie experience. But if I were to carve out and set aside all the scenes that I don't like in this movie, what remains is some of the most fascinating stuff that I expect to see on the screen all year. I think Ari Aster is enormously talented, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if in 20 years we're talking about him as like the greatest director of his generation. I think he will continue to grow. He's obviously enormously talented and has soaring ambition. Whether or not this movie can replicate the success of something like Everything Everywhere All at Once, I'm skeptical. This movie is more expensive than Everything Everywhere All at Once, but that movie was so fast and so energetic. And whether you liked it or didn't like it, I found the tone to be a little bit silly, but there's no denying that there was like an exuberant quality to it that was very easy to kind of get carried along. This movie is just, like I said, it places tons of demands on the audience. And I do think there is a role for movies out there that place a lot of demands on the patience and the taste and the knowledge of the audience. But holy shit, 3 hours is a lot to ask of anybody. But on the other hand, this movie has so much for you to enjoy. I mean, just little cameos by people like Bill Hader, who's absolutely incredible in this, or even filmmaker David Mamet. I don't know to what degree Ari Aster has kind of looked to David Mamet's career or something he would like to model his own career on. But David Mamet obviously was more of like a playwright and a screenwriter before becoming a filmmaker, but became damn good filmmaker in his own right. If you don't, or if you're skeptical, check out House of Games, which you've written and directed, or if you want to see a good example of his scripts, see Glengarry Glen Ross. It's absolutely astonishing. But I'll be rooting for this movie to do well because A24 has finally grown to the point where they're creating those mid-range budgeted films that are very much an endangered species. We see a lot of films that are made for a couple million, and we see a lot of films that are made for like 100 to 200 million, but very few adult-oriented movies that are not trying to be the next big Super Mario Brothers franchise or the next big Lord of the Rings franchise, but movies that are cinema, that are pure, raw cinema. And this movie absolutely is. And I feel like this is going to be a great test to see what is the size of the audience that really loves and trusts the A24 brand, because I feel like what we're seeing now is the natural evolution of what we saw with like Miramax in the 90s. Like throughout the course of the 90s, Miramax and Dimension Films, they went from doing these super low budget indie flicks, and by the end of the 90s, they were a giant force. They were winning Oscars, and the budgets just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually they got sold off to Disney, and then the story was over. But A24 is definitely reaching a career high in terms of awards and budget and box office. Let's see how long it lasts. So what we're left with is either an incredibly brilliant movie with a lot of terrible scenes, or perhaps a bad movie with a lot of astonishingly brilliant scenes. Pick your poison. But I think that's all I have to say for now. I reserve the right to change my mind about all of the above if I wake up tomorrow feeling differently about the movie. I really feel like this is one of those movies that's going to take a while to like kind of sink in and settle in. But at a minimum, it's got 2 hours of genius filmmaking, unlike anything else you'll probably see this year. So I strongly recommend that people go, but I totally understand if you're like, dude, that movie fucking sucked. What are you talking about? I'm like, to each their own. People are going to be very torn and very divided on this movie. So I eagerly look forward to all the different reactions and conversations out there, because I feel like when diehard film freaks are debating and critiquing and discussing movies that they're really into, that is a net positive for film culture all around. But I hope you enjoyed this review. If so, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell. But thanks again for watching. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.